Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel. Today, our panel's title is Biden's Iran Strategy and America's Use of Targeted Killings. We have two wonderful panelists today. I'm going to allow themselves to each introduce themselves, give their presentation, and at the end, we'll have time for question and answers. Feel free to use our chat or the question and answer section to direct any of your questions to either the panelists or both of the panelists. Thank you very much, and we're looking forward to, first, we're going to kick it off with John Jamison giving his presentation.
Good morning, everybody. My name is John Jamison. I'm a doctoral student at American Military University. I'm also a former Naval Intelligence Officer, 21 years across the strategic, operational, and tactical realm. At AMU, I'm studying to be a doctor in strategic intelligence, and today I'm going to provide some findings on targeted killings on a research paper that I just recently finished. I'm going to share a brief. My presentation is coming up. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my slides. My topic for my research paper is America's use of targeted killings, specifically looking at legal and moral issues during armed conflict. And again, I'm very excited to be briefing this topic today. My research paper really consisted of beginning with looking at targeted killings, conducting a literature review. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research design and methodology, get into the findings, and then provide the conclusion and sort of future research areas of interest. So the minute I delved into defining targeted killings as a research topic, I instantly saw how complex this situation is. As I want to kind of scope this presentation for you and right off the bat tell you that my research paper is not designed to be the end all be all on the debate for targeted killings. I'm specifically looking at addressing America's use of targeted killings, the legality, the morality, and the ethics, and are they legally authorized from both an American domestic perspective and from international laws governing it. And so the thesis for this topic, I wanted to focus specifically on the use of drone strikes. And so looking at the definition of targeted killings, it immediately got convoluted. There is no agreed upon international definition of targeted killings. So for the purpose of this research paper, I'm really focusing on the definition from Tamar Meisels, which is also incorporating a little bit of the international laws of armed conflict definition. And that really defines targeted killings as the use of lethal force that's attributable to a subject of international law with the intent, premeditation, and deliberation to kill individually selected persons who are not in physical custody of those targeting them. And this includes the international perspective of placing targeting killings in the context of international armed conflicts and non-international armed conflicts. And it specifically addresses those who are taking part in direct hostilities, and the targeting killings are conducted by the state. And so that's a very loaded definition. There is a lot of interpretation in that definition. And as I go through the research that I've discovered, definitions and words matter, especially from a literature review perspective. We're going to talk about the laws of armed conflict. We're going to talk about U.S. domestic laws that authorize the use of targeted killings. And we're going to talk about international legalities and how targeted killings are viewed outside of Western perspectives. And so it's very important to keep in mind that targeted killings, they're shaping the dynamics of modern warfare. And by that, I mean that the use of targeted killings has become easier. It's become easier legally from an American perspective, and it's become almost easier from a military perspective. So as the U.S. pulls conventional forces out and away from conflict zones, it becomes much easier to use targeted killings and drone strikes to shape foreign policy. There are domestic and international ramifications for targeted killing. Targeted killings are nothing new. They've been around since the beginning of time. And how governments use targeted killings can impact both domestic politics, social, cultural, economic views, as well as damage international relations. And we'll talk a little bit more about that once we get to the area for future research. Targeted killings also continue to set a dangerous precedent. And by that, I mean, as if the US is using targeted killings in both international and non-international conflicts, adhering to the laws of armed conflict, there's nothing to stop targeted killings to be conducted by our adversaries or by other nations. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it with Russia. We see it with North Korea. We see it with Israel. We see it. People are justifying targeted killings based on their own national security interests. And what this research paper is going to do is dive deeper into the American domestic legal system, the perceptions that presidential administrations have used, the authorizations they've used for targeted killings. We'll look at how it shapes their political administrations, and we'll also look at the impact for international relations and as a grand strategy as well. And so jumping into the literature review, what I quickly began to discover was there's really two camps of thought. The first camp throughout the literature review, and there are dozens of academic articles, dozens of policy papers, dozens of reviews that address targeted killings. Again, today I'm not here to solve the debate on targeted killings. The literature review that I'm looking at from my research paper focuses on U.S. domestic laws and international laws and ethics. And then what I did in the research paper was I took those schools of thought and applied them to use cases. And so throughout the literature review, I quickly saw that from an American perspective in U.S. domestic law, a lot of the authorization comes from the 2001 AMUF, or the authorization of military force, and that all generated from the 2011 terrorist attacks and really kicked off the war on terror. And so there's going to be a lot of discussion today about the AMUF, as well as 50 U.S. Code 1541, the joint resolution that provides constitutional war powers. And as I dug through the literature review from a legal perspective from U.S. domestic law, I quickly began to see that as we apply the AMUF, as we apply constitutional laws in the context of self-defense, there is very little or no judicial review that exists on how targeted killings are conducted by the administration. And that brings into a question, I'll speak a little bit more about this later, about transparency and authorizations, as well as accountability. When I turn to the international law and looking at targeted killings in terms of international human law, human rights law, the first thing that popped out was definitions are very ambiguous, and they're designed to be that way. There's throughout a lot of the definitions, we'll talk about combatants, non-combatants, civilians, how the U.S. uses definitions to justify targeted killings, and how those definitions are not accepted by the international community and what that means. We'll talk about words such as significant, or proximity, or military necessity, or imminence. These are all words that are shaped and designed by individuals conducting targeted killings based off of perceptions. And those perceptions are driven by both domestic and international, internal and external factors. And so the definitions are not agreed upon, and therein lies a lot of the debate. Are they targeted killings, or are they extrajudicial killings? And so what America looks at as targeted killings in defense, a lot of the international community looks at as extrajudicial executions. And so we'll talk a little bit about that more in the findings section. The research design and methodology I used was a exploratory design looking at use cases as well as quantitative numbers. And I'll begin with describing some of the qualitative use cases. I looked at the targeted killings of Abu Musab al-Zakari in Iraq, Ayman al-Zawahiri in Pakistan, Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, as well as the history of Israeli targeted killings from a non-Western perspective. And I specifically chose these use cases because they're each individually different in terms of applying U.S. domestic law and international law to these targeted killings. For instance, the Zarqawi targeted killing in Iraq occurred during the war in Iraq. And so President George Bush used targeted killings along with a lot of conventional military operations. And so when you look at the quantitative numbers down below, you can kind of see the Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen strikes, minus Iraq or minus Iraq, but you kind of get the quantitative numbers across the three different presidential administrations on the use of drone strikes. And as I mentioned before, this research paper really focuses on targeted killings using drone strikes, but targeted killings can occur using airstrikes, snipers, conventional military operations. There's a lot of different ways to conduct targeted killings. For this purpose, for this research, I really focused on drone strikes. Drone strikes get a lot of the attention. For the Zawahiri case in Pakistan, that targeted killing was conducted under the precipice of the war on terror, and occurring in a non-international conflict zone that's not internationally recognized, and that strike occurred without the authorization of the host nation government. And so, I'll talk a little bit about the methodologies and the legality of that. Also, the Alawaki strike in Yemen. Again, this case was very interesting because this was a targeted killing against a U.S. citizen. And so when I looked at the literature review and research on this, I approached it from a U.S. constitutional legality perspective, looking at targeting U.S. citizens and killing them overseas in non-conflict zones. Is that legal? And when I get to the findings in the use case, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then in terms of Israeli targeted killings, the Israelis really came on the scene in the early 2000s to bringing forth their policy of using targeted killings in the occupied territories. And we'll talk a little bit about the legalities and what the international courts and what the Israeli courts decided on a lot of the Israeli targeted killings. The use of airstrikes, was it proportional? Is it unnecessary suffering? Military necessity? And as we talk about the findings in targeted killings, everything that occurs with targeted killings has to occur legally under the laws of armed conflict or international human laws. And there's four main core principles for the laws of armed conflict. So as we discuss the US legalities and the international legalities, it's all placed under the context of distinction of the target, military necessity, unnecessary suffering, and proportionality. All four of those core principles have to be adhered to in international law to be legally recognized as an authorized targeted killing. And so from a quantitative number, it's very interesting. Of note, these are all open source reports of known drone strikes. This is coming from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is one of the major databases that keeps track of drone strikes. Now that particular source does tend to swing a little bit biased towards more liberal efforts. However, the data pulled from this for this graph specifically looks at the numbers, the quantitative numbers of known strikes that have been corroborated with local media and reports. These numbers do not constitute every known strike, and these numbers do not constitute any classified drone strikes that might have occurred that were not reported. And so it's interesting to see the pattern from a quantitative perspective, where President Bush really used targeted killings in conjunction with conventional military operations. President Obama's use of targeted drone strikes actually increased, and the causation with that is because of his foreign policy from a counterterrorism perspective. And so President Obama used more drone strikes because it kept American troops from having to be on foreign soil. His policy, his administration really wanted to reduce the number of U.S. soldiers overseas, and drone strikes became the weapon of choice from a counter-terrorist perspective. When President Trump came into office, there was also the military surge back in Afghanistan. And so President Trump continued the use of President Obama's drone strike strategy, and you can actually see the surge in numbers. That surge when President Trump came into office correlates with the military surge in Afghanistan. And so that is the research design and methodology. As I move to the findings, applying the literature review to the findings, there were two specific camps, basically those for U.S. targeted killings and those against U.S. targeted killings. A lot of the U.S. domestic laws use the legal justifications for the right to self-defense. And so from the US perspective, looking at Iraq and Afghanistan as legitimate armed conflicts, Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right to self-defense in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan, the UN Security Council Resolution 1368, which authorized the use of military force in self-defense. And so the perception on how the United States looks at the right of self-defense is really the big target of debate. But in terms of the argument for looking at strikes outside of battlefields, that falls underneath the counterterrorism strategy. Countries like Yemen and Pakistan, the United States justifies those strikes in terms of military necessity and the imminent threat. And so under the Obama administration, signature strikes and personality strikes were very common in terms of drone strikes. And those, for instance, personality strikes, it was literally listed names for targeted killings. The signature strikes were more along the lines of pattern of life, terrorist pattern of life, and do they constitute an imminent threat? And when you talk about Al-Awlaki as a U.S. citizen, that strike was justified underneath the concept of an imminent threat in terms of pattern of life. And so how the United States applies that is really based off of U.S. laws, the AMUF, the authorization for use of military force, and the constitutional war powers in terms of self-defense and military necessity. Now, there's also things like just war theory that comes into display, and that's how the United States really can justify targeted killings as well in terms of the legality of the laws of armed conflict. And so from a just war theory, using drone strikes is better than using airstrikes. It reduces civilian casualties, or it's supposed to reduce civilian casualties. That was not the case in the Pakistan strike. In the Pakistan strike, not only was it conducted without the authorization of the Pakistani government, but there were also civilian casualties as well. And so that particular strike was found to be in violation of international law. And in terms of America's vision on the war against Al-Qaeda, that from an international perspective, that had the ramifications from changing the war on terror to the war on Al-Qaeda, because of the way the AMUF is framed and how that justifies targeted killings outside of international armed conflict. And so when we look at the findings against targeted killings from an international perspective, the legality is extremely heavy. And the basis argument from an international perspective is these targeted killings are being conducted from a counterterrorism strategy that really mixes the laws of war with what has been typically considered counterterrorism strategies from a criminal law enforcement perspective. And so when the US conducts a targeted killing outside of internationally recognized armed conflict zones, that strike is conducted under the precipice that we cannot put boots on ground, and that the host nation is not willing to go in and capture that known or suspected terrorist. And the international community looks at that in terms of international human rights laws. Every human being has the right to due process. Life should not be taken without the due process, and it becomes a legality issue. Again, the summary against really looks at American targeted strikes as being under the misguided perception of an armed conflict. And so when the United States claims that they're in a war against terrorism, that is a non-international armed conflict, non-international armed conflicts have to meet certain criteria. And that's in terms of the extent of the conflict. Is it meeting a certain threshold, and are the non-state parties associated in non-international conflicts, are they organized? Are they combatants? Are they carrying weapons? What's the extent of the armed activity against the state? And do they fall under the Geneva Convention legalities to actually be considered combatants? And so from an American perspective, you'll see that the term non-combatant used. Well, non-combatant is not an internationally recognized definition. And so you're either a combatant or you're a civilian. And so from a terrorist perspective, when they drop weapons, are they still considered combatants or are they civilians? So terrorists are typically considered civilians because they don't meet that armed conflict timeline in terms of providing hostilities. And so when that terrorist no longer is involved in an armed conflict, they fall under the Geneva Conventions and the rights to due process. And that's where the targeted killings really conflict in the debate against extrajudicial executions and killings. And so those were the findings. Now, the key takeaways from this, as I was doing the research again, this is an extremely complicated topic. We could probably talk all day about targeted killings, and we could probably hold a 2-day convention on targeted killings. But what I found from the legalities actually supported my original thesis, and that's, even though they're controversial, America's use, specifically looking at drone strikes, are legally and ethically permissible under both U.S. Domestic and international law during internationally recognized states of armed conflict. So anything that's not recognized internationally as an armed conflict comes down to being an illegal targeted killing, and that falls underneath the extrajudicial executions. But if it's legally recognized by the international community and international law, targeted killings are legally and ethically permissible. But it opens up a bigger Pandora's box, and that's looking at the U.S. domestic laws that authorize the use of targeted killings. And what needs to be revisited is the 2001 and 2002 authorization for use of military force. That is a bipartisan joint resolution accepted by Congress that authorizes the president to continue to conduct counterterrorism targeted killings against Al-Qaeda affiliates, and any other terrorist that threatens the United States. Why is the AMUF concerning? Well, there's no geographic constraints. There's no time constraints. There's no time limitations. There's vague details regarding authorization and who can be targeted in the AMUF. There's currently a debate from the Biden administration talking about revisiting the AMUF. It literally gives the United States the ability to continue and extend the targeted killings across the globe with no end in sight. And so that leads to the need for improved transparency and judicial review on the use of targeted killings. Targeted killings from the United States perspective on the war of terror, we're literally, are we attacking social constructs? Does this open up the avenue to conduct targeted killings for domestic terrorism in the United States? Does this open up the ability to conduct targeted killings on the war on drugs or the war on illicit trafficking? Do targeted killings actually reduce terrorism, or do those drones that are flying over top of civilian territories every day actually provide negative impact in international relations to the United States? And do they embolden our adversaries? If we use targeted killings, what's to stop China or Russia or North Korea from conducting a drone strike targeted killings in the continental United States against a target that they consider to be a threat to their international national security interests? And again, how does the use of targeted killings in future warfare, how is that going to impact the use of autonomous weapons? Removing the human element, the human psyche, the human culture from warfare makes it easier. And from an American counterterrorist perspective, killing is easier than capturing, and that's across the board from an international perspective as well. And so these are some areas to think about and consider, and how will targeted killings impact and shape this current administration's grand strategy? Will we see the Biden administration continue to use Trump and Obama targeted killing strategies in the war on terror, or are they actually going to revisit and address some of the issues with the AMUF? And so that's a lot of information. The research paper covers all of these topics. if you read the paper, you'll see that there's a lot of definitions, there's a lot of ambiguity, and there's a lot of debate. Again, the purpose of this research paper was not to solve those debates. It's to bring to light at a very high level some of the issues involved with targeting killings and how that's viewed upon from an American domestic perspective as well as an international perspective. And with that, that concludes my brief. And I'll stand by for any questions.
Hey, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate your presentation. We're going to hold questions until the end. If you're a participant, feel free to put your question in either the Q&A section or the chat, and then we'll address them at the end. In the meantime, we're going to pass our program over to Shahram, and he's going to give his presentation and also introduce himself. So thank you very much. Pass the program right on over.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for being here. My name is Shahram Ahmadi Nasab Emran. I am a bioethicist, and I have a background in Middle East and Iranian studies. And US-Iran policy is one of my fields of interest. And in today's presentation, I am going to see where we stand now on US-Iran policy and suggest a recommendation, a policy option that has not been used before, which is supporting the people of Iran. So with that being said, I start my presentation. Okay, the subject of my presentation is supporting the people of Iran should be part of Biden's Iran strategy. That's my suggestion. That's my policy suggestion. So first, there is a high level of importance attached to Iran policy, because since its inception, the Iranian regime has been behind conflicts in the region, including multiple attacks on US forces. And Iranian regime has been a main destabilizing factor in the region because of its pivotal role in many regional conflicts, including in Syria, in Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and elsewhere. And in addition to that, the Iranian regime has been the state sponsor of international terrorist activities in South America, in Europe, in Asia. And there are two more issues which make Iran policy an important subject for the Biden administration. First is Iran's nuclear program, and the other is its long-range missile or ICBM program. And an important feature of the Iranian regime is its support for terrorist activities. Just as an example, on June 30th, 2018, Belgian police officers learned about a possible attack against the annual meeting of the MEK, Iranian main opposition group, and they stopped a couple traveling in a Mercedes car. In their luggage, they found 550 grams of the unstable explosive and a detonator. And the device was described to be of professional quality, so to speak. The court ruled that Asadullah Assadi, an Iranian diplomat, and 3 others sought to kill top leaders of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, NCRI, during a rally near Paris. The plot was uncovered ahead of time by German, French, and Belgian police. In February 2021, Assadi was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempting to bomb the Iranian opposition rally in France. That's just an example of the terrorist activities and how the Iranian regime and all its diplomatic apparatus is in the service of its terrorist activities. So with that being said, with this level of importance attached to Iran and Iran policy, let's see what has been the US policy towards Iran. Appeasement policy has been the actual policy towards Iran in the past. During the Reagan administration, the official US policy was isolating the mullahs regime. However, in secret, the US sent arms to fictitious moderates in return for their help in releasing American hostages taken by Hezbollah. As a result, you can see America lost the trust of its regional partners, while Iran received the weapons it badly needed. And it was encouraged to expand its hostage-taking business. And also, the Europeans went down a similar path in 1992, opening their critical dialogue with Tehran and offering the moderate Rafsanjani various economic and financial incentives to persuade Iran to change its behavior. After that, evidence at the Mykonos trial in 1997, however, made it crystal clear that during the same period of time, the mullahs were expanding their terrorist activities in Europe. And after that, European Union states recalled their ambassadors from Tehran and ended the dialogue. However, soon after the election of the reformist Khatami, 2 months later, the European Union immediately restarted its engagement policy under the name of comprehensive dialogue. And during the Bush administration, and despite their harsh rhetoric toward Iran, the same policy of appeasement was in full display when the coalition forces targeted camps of Iranian dissidents in Iraq. Again, when in 2009, millions of Iranians poured into the streets to voice their opposition to the ruling regime, the Obama administration looked the other way. Supposedly, they reasoned that American support would only make it easier for the regime to crack down on the dissidents. However, the people of Iran needed America's moral and political support and voiced that demand in one of their most popular slogans. With that being said, during the Trump administration, especially during the last 2.5 years of the Trump administration, the official policy of the United States towards Iran was the policy of maximum pressure. It was argued that mounting pressure destabilizes the regime. It was composed of certain crippling sanctions. It also included depriving the regime of sources of oil and gas revenues. And an important part of the policy towards Iran was that proxies action were regarded as regime's actions. And the regime couldn't longer hide behind its proxies. And another aspect of the policy of maximum pressure was increasing the price of trade and financial interactions with the regime. The main premise in that policy was that mounting pressure destabilizes the regime and forces its decision makers to change their behavior. And also depriving the regime of material resources decreases its capabilities for destabilizing activities. And the end goal was to bring the regime to the table for a comprehensive deal addressing its regional and long-range missile threats. At the same time, we had arguments made by the pundits, the corrupt Iranian media, the regime officials, and not surprisingly, echoed by the mainstream media in the United States. They pushed the narrative that the policy of maximum pressure is helping the regime, and it causes Iranians to rally behind the flag. The policy of increasing pressure on Iran, they argued, backfires. And they also argued that nationalist sentiments among Iranians is an important factor that contributes to this reaction, this supposedly negative reaction by the Iranians. And exerting pressure on the regime, they argued, unites the people of Iran behind the regime. That was the main argument. So were the pundits right? So if they were right, we should have seen the results by now. However, in November 2019, there was a nationwide protest that lasted for several weeks. Frustrated Iranians took to the streets in more than 180 cities across the country, and they called for regime change. Again, in January 11, 2020, in the aftermath of shooting down the Ukrainian plane, there was a renewed outbreak of anti-regime protests. And there was a demand for regime change also. And there is an ongoing protest and strikes in Sistan and Baluchistan since February 23rd, 2021. So it seems like pundits were wrong. Not in a single case in all these examples of protests that erupted in Iran during the last 3 years. Not in a single case the people supported the regime or chanted anti-American slogans. In all the protests, Iranians unanimously showed support for a free, non-nuclear, and democratic Iran. And in fact, a popular slogan in the protest has been, "Our enemy is here, is right here. They lie that our enemy is in America." So you need to correct certain myths about Iranian uprising. Here are 5 myths that, in my view, need to be corrected. First is that these unrest begin with local demands. Yes, that's true, but they invariably turn into anti-regime protests. And the other one is that the current wave of protests is not unique. And another feature is that Iranian protests do not lack an organized resistance movement. And the fact that nationalism is part of Iranian culture, but Iranian dissidents need the support of free world. And moral support is necessary, but not enough. Regarding the first one, it's been an invariable feature of protest in Iran that it is now an established pattern for anti-government protests, that they start whenever Iranians get a chance to take to the streets, even after a soccer game or the death of a celebrity. But they soon turn into an anti-regime protest. Examples are here. In 2009, protests started with the presidential election and the disputes after that. In 2018, protests began in Mashhad over certain economic policies. In 2019, protests started when the regime raised the prices of gas. Or in 2020, protests erupted after the IRGC targeted Ukrainian plane. And in 2021, the ongoing protests started after IRGC agents killed fuel traders in Balochistan. So another feature is that the current wave of protests is not unique. It's not an exception. The impetus behind the unrest is the same as that behind the protests in 2020, 2019, 2018, 2009, and 1999, the early 1990s, and the early 1980s. In all these examples, dissidents against the regime was behind the protests. While each of these movements had its own starting point, fraudulent election in 2009, the student movement in 1999, and so on, the main reason has remained the same. The Iranian dissident majority is striving for freedom and democracy. And another feature is that Iranian protesters do not lack organization, despite the myth that they lack. They do. The pro-regime lobbyists have tried hard to make the case that the current unrest is a temporary, sporadic phenomenon doomed to fail. Iranians, in fact, have an organized resistance movement that has withstood 4 decades of the regime's brutalities. The National Council of Resistance of Iran, NCRI, and its main component group, the Mujahideen Khalq, MEK, represent the voice of Iranian dissident majority. And in fact, the organizing power of the MEK and its widespread network inside and outside Iran has enabled a quick turn of each and every Iranian gathering into an anti-government protest. Yes, it's true that nationalism is part of Iranian culture, but Iranian dissidents still need support. Nationalism has been used by the pro-regime lobbyists to warn Western policymakers against backing Iranian protesters, supposedly because it would be interpreted as meddling. This is simply not true. Iranians clearly expressed that moral need for moral support in one of their most famous slogans during the 2009 protests. They said, Obama, Obama, you are either with them, meaning the regime, or with us, the people of Iran. Unfortunately, the Obama administration was so enthralled with the prospect of a nuclear deal and looked the other way. America's inaction was perceived by the regime as a green light for its massive crackdown on the protesters. Moral support is necessary, but not enough. America needs to take the additional step of recognizing the organized opposition as the true representative of the Iranian people. First, because siding with Iranian freedom fighters is in the interest of the United States. A free and democratic Iran will be the best ally of the US. Second, because support for those who resist against tyranny and tyrannical regimes reflect the core values upon which America was and is founded. Third reason is that recognition of Iranian resistance as representing the Iranian people and the will of the Iranian nation is essentially acknowledging a matter of fact. And the fourth reason is that while recognition of the Iranian resistance has no financial, economic, or military burden for the United States, this message of support for Iranian dissidents fighting for freedom and democracy also send their tyrannical rulers the strongest message possible. It is time for bold action in Iran and abroad to bring real change to Iran and the region. So with that being said, where we stand today, the policy of maximum pressure on Iran has brought the United States closer to the goal of changing Iran's behavior, because the successive waves of uprising are going to force the regime to either change its malicious behavior or risk being toppled or crippled by the dissident majority. It is the people of Iran, interestingly, who are themselves exerting maximum pressure on the regime, which overlaps with the previous administration's policy of maximum pressure. On the subject of Iran policy, the people of Iran and their organized resistance movement are the best ally of the United States and the US administration in achieving the goal of ending Iran regime's destabilizing domestic and regional activities, its desire for nuclear weapons, and its intercontinental ballistic missiles program. And here is my concluding remark. The main ingredient of a successful Middle East policy is an effective Iran policy that addresses the regime's destabilizing activities. Among the players in contemporary Iran, Biden has no better ally than the people of Iran and their organized resistance movement. Acknowledging the fact that the regime doesn't represent the people of Iran and recognizing the inalienable right of Iranians to fight the tyranny must be the next step, complementing the previous administration's policy of maximum pressure. And here is my last word. The US administration must consider recognition of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the coalition of Iranian groups fighting for freedom and democracy, as a true representative of the will and desire of Iranian dissident majority. With that, I finish my presentation.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I would like to welcome both of the panelists back. I currently have a question for Tony right now. I don't know, I'm gonna direct you over to the Q&A panel. Are you able to see it with a question from Michelle Watts?
I am, yeah.
Wonderful, thanks. I'll let you take it away.
Awesome.
And while you read that, I just want to thank you both for your presentations. I thought they were very interesting and offered really helpful perspectives on a very complex topic.
So answering the first part of that question, Dr. Watts, I would say that according to international law, there are certain drone strikes the U.S. has conducted that were illegal, and those are when you look outside of internationally recognized armed conflicts, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, and that can even be argued as UN Security Council 1738 authorized the right to self-defense, but it did not authorize the use of armed force against Iraq or Afghanistan. And so that debate is out there. If it's internationally recognized, they are not illegal outside of the armed conflict zone, such as in Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia. Those could easily be construed as illegal targeted killings, and that gets into the debate about what is a non-international armed conflict, and does it meet those laws of armed conflict criteria? And just because that target is a threat to U.S. national security interests does not make it legal to conduct that targeted killing against an individual when you can either capture through counterterrorism operations from or a host nation supplying that individual. And so there is a strong argument that those drone strikes outside of internationally recognized armed conflicts are illegal. In terms of the rule that was enacted under Obama and overturned by Trump regarding public disclosures of drone casualties, I have not seen an updated status of that. That there was a move to make drone strikes more transparent. I did not see that come to fruition when Trump took office. I saw more of the same policies regarding accountability and transparency from a drone strike perspective, and that falls also underneath the targeted killings and signature strike counterterrorism processes. But I have not seen anything updated on that, and I don't believe that that public disclosure has happened in terms of drone casualties specifically. We're at the mercy of local media and numbers that feed that data set.
Wonderful. Do either of you have any, I don't see any questions currently, but I was wondering if either of you had any other closing remarks you'd like to make or follow up on your presentation?
No, I don't have anything to add right now.
No problem. Well, I'm gonna leave the questions open just for a moment more. And if we don't see any questions, then we'll just close the session. It's been very informative and I really, really appreciate both of your time. It's extremely valuable and I appreciate you lending your thoughts to, again, a very difficult and hopefully more positive future for a very complex issue.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to brief.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, I don't see any open questions, so I'll just close the panel for today. We have many other interesting panels coming up. So thank you very much both for your time, for sharing our expertise. It's greatly appreciated. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.